Association of Gynecology Society of Bihar and Jharkhand, and founder member, Bhagalpur Menopause Society for 2015 to 2019. Vice President, Bhagalpur Obstetric Gynec Society, Vice President, Bhagalpur Menopause Society, Vice President, IMA Bhagalpur Branch, Post Honorable Secretary, IMA Bhagalpur Branch for 2014 to 2015. Post Honorable Secretary for Bhagalpur Obstetric Gynec Society 2007-2008. Organizing Secretary of East Zone IMS Conference 2018. Organizing Secretary of Second AOGS BJ Conference at 2008. Presented papers at national and international conferences. Field of interest is high risk pregnancy, endoscopy, and infertility. Welcome, ma'am.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
Pratibha. And I'll also introduce Dr. Madhuri, ma'am. Dr. Madhuri, ma'am, Clinical Director of Dr. Patil's Fertility and Endoscopy Clinic, Bangalore, Editor-in-Chief for Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences, an official publication of the Indian Society for Assisted Reproduction, Associate Editor for the Onco Fertility Journal, Editorial Board Member, Endocrine Society 2020 and 2021, Founder Chairperson of Karnataka Chapter of Indian Society for Assisted Reproduction, Vice President and Founder Member of Fertility Preservation Society of India, Vice President and Founder Member, the PCOS Society India, Principal and Course Coordinator and Examiner for Fellowship and Certificate Course in Reproductive Medicine of Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, Karnataka, and Indian College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, ISAR and Aspire. Member of International Reproductive Medicine Research Network, written several chapters and edited several books, publications in national and international journals. Thank you, ma'am, and welcome, Madhuri, ma'am, for this event.
Thank you.
And now I request Vidya Tubi, ma'am, to do the honor of launching our Shield Connect. And for all on the panel of doctors, also for Shobna, ma'am, Madhuri, ma'am, and Vidya Tubi, ma'am, this is specially like we have launched this Shield Connect, which is a platform for all the doctors to connect with each other and certainly know from each other's experience.
Oh.
We are facilitating such an event. So, ma'am, it's an honor for us if you can launch this Shield Connect, Vidya Tubi, ma'am.
I have to click on this.
She will facilitate, ma'am. Chitrakala.
Chitrakala. Yeah.
Okay, congrats, Shield, for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
They have to click themselves, I think. Yeah.
So this gives us the idea of, Shield tries to connect and dynamic platform to connect doctors.
Yeah. So there are question answers or they are speaking or something?
You can also have questions, ma'am, and the answer will be addressed by experts in the field, or also our medical department can handle. Dr. Prachi, today she's not available for some personal reasons. Yeah. And you also want to present some of the cases, and you want other people to know and learn from those. Definitely, it will be helpful for us, and we can post
Madhuri
it here. Your
Madhuri
experiences, all those things. It's like a one place get together for several of the doctors to learn from seniors, and also for seniors to share their experience and guide through the next generation.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Shield, and welcome all for this special episode on PCOS, and this is focus for the infertility part. And we know that this PCOS affects a woman from womb to tomb, and various complications and the consequences of PCOS we know. Right, in obstetrics, there is 3 times increase in the various metabolic disorders, and also in perimenopausal age group, there is increase in the depression, anxiety disorders, and also the reduced quality of life. Of course, infertility and PCOS are also very closely interrelated, and there are stalwarts here to speak on PCOS and infertility. First of all, I invite Dr. Shobna Mohandas, who will be talking on lifestyle modification, and basically her focus is on nutrition in PCOS. So over to Shobna Mohandas, and then Dr. Pratibha and Dr. Madhuri Patil. So thank you being a part of this Food, Drugs and Medical Surgical Equipment Committee's focused webinar on PCOS and infertility revisited. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to connecting us with Shield and sharing our knowledge on these interesting topics. So now I'll go on to share my screen.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm sharing, but I'm trying to go on slide share, which is not going.
Huh?
Okay, yeah, now we are done. Yes, it's come. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to talk on nutrition in PCOS, which is a difficult topic, as you all know, and I thank Dr. Vidya Tobi and Shield Healthcare for giving me this opportunity. PCOS is a time where people just, we don't know what is PCOS, first of all. Rotterdam said that 2 of the 3 criteria, oligoamenorrhea, hyperandrogenism, and characteristic appearance of ovaries by ultrasound. This is where we all go, we all get jinxed. Because even if they don't have amenorrhea or hyperandrogenism, if they have some kidney stone and they do scan, and if they see multiple follicles in the ovary, they get scared. But this multiple follicles in the ovary happens in the adolescents even without any PCOS, without hyperinsulinemia. So the basic problem in PCOS is hyperinsulinemia, which thereby gives hyperandrogenism. So if that thing is not there, just seeing follicles on the ovary is not PCOS. And my talk today is not for that particular patient where you are just seeing follicles in the ovary on ultrasound and you label that person PCOS, making them scared. So there are many criteria by many societies because why there is a PCOS society and there is a vice president sitting here. That's because we need a society to decide what is what over the years. It's still not decided. That's why we are still talking about it. So now I will talk to you about how the patients come to you and for whom I'm giving this talk. Most of the patients come like, especially in this corona era. I eat very little, but I'm putting on weight, doctor, especially around the weight. And now I found that I've got PCOS. Come on, cure it, and then I will slim. That's all that I need from you. I already eat very little, I'm telling you, so I can't diet anymore. Don't ask me to do that. So I've got PCOD, treat me, give me some medicine and cure it. But we all know there is no magic bullet for that, and but we have to come round to them and decide how to get it done. Another person will come, have got severe dysmenorrhea, she may not be fat. And when you see the ultrasound, you see huge ovaries. And then you know that is PCOD, even if she's not fat. That's also something that you have to deal with. And of course, many of them come like this with either too much of acne or too much of hirsutism. And then the skin specialist refers the person to you because the ultrasound is showing PCOD. So these are some of the reasons why they come to you. And here we've got a whole lot of medicines which I'm not going into. First of all, we'll deal with obesity because the prevalence of obesity, as you can see from the slide, is very high in the obese women. Not that thin people don't get PCOS, but the prevalence is higher, 34, 31. Frequency is much higher in that fatter people. So we first deal with obesity. Okay. There is a confusion. That's the main cause of all worry. What is the confusion? We all think that obesity leads to PCOD. But the patient thinks that PCOD is leading to obesity. And but this doubt is also there in the minds of American Society of Reproductive Medicine. They're also not very clear if women with PCOD harbor a unique predisposition to obesity. So it's not just the patient. Even the Pandits are wondering whether it is PCOD leading to obesity. So there is a lack of clarity there. But whatever it is, we have to deal with obesity. Diet is basically restricting energy to 500 to 1000 kilocalories per day, and the dietary fat has to be reduced to less than 30% of energy intake. And the optimal dose of carbohydrate and protein, we still don't know for each patient what it is. Exercise and other things I'm not talking today. My focus is only on diet. Look at that, a South Indian diet. Suppose one dosa, little bit of rice, and you already have your 800 and 900 calories are gone. Where are you going to restrict it now? What else she will eat? So how can you do it? So the very low calorie diet or very low energy diets, energy levels are between 200 to 800 calories only. And that is over with breakfast and food. So we have to find out ways of how to manage it. So, but this diet is supposed to be very good by one, higher amounts of protein, which promotes satiety. Two, ongoing gluconeogenesis to compensate for the body's carbohydrate needs. We do need carbohydrates. That's where that 800 is there. And there is increased diuresis, so no waterlogging, loss of glycogen stores and their associated water is there. And high levels of circulating ketones. If the fats are not there, you can imagine a vomiting hyperemesis patient, what happens? There are more ketone bodies. Because there are ketone bodies are there, they vomit and they don't have appetite. So the same thing happens with this. But the leptin levels also go down in this. Sometimes you may have to add leptin, this way of dieting. Then there is something where low fat diets are there. Fat is only restricted to less than 25% to 35%. And here, fat goes means what? Weight loss occurs over the first 6 months. Great. Everybody feels great. But then after that, the lean body mass is there. And when your fat is gone, what happens? You substitute the fat with high glycemic index foods. That will increase the hunger. And what will happen when there is increased hunger and you take more high glycemic food? What happens? There is rapid absorption of sugar, large surge in insulin secretion. That's what we don't want. And that will promote anabolism and further hypoglycemia and hunger and further the same cycle. So although initially it sounds damn good, it's not for the long run good. But things appear different to different people, like in this picture, and you have other ways of in keeping it, and one is low carbohydrate diet. We all know that glycemic index should be low. What is glycemic index? It's based on the rise in blood glucose in response to the test food compared with the rice after 50-gram portion of white bread. Because white bread is what the Goras eat. And so they are comparing white bread with all other foods. So in comparison, what is glycemic index is the glycemic index. So 2 randomized clinical trials have shown that low glycemic index, although the weight actually did not reduce that much, but there was a higher resting energy expenditure, lower triglycerides, and less insulin resistance. So actual weight did not reduce, but the insulin resistance reduced. That's what you are treating in PCOD. So that is what will happen in low carbohydrate diet. And another is a high protein diet. In high protein diet, what happens? It is where 15 to 25%, quarter of your diet should be protein. And you and me eat that much of meat or egg or pulses or whatever, 25% of your diet has to be protein. And that will actually reduce your body weight to 50%. All this shuttle badminton, Sindhu and all, they eat a lot of protein. Kohli, they can't eat paratha and paneer matar masala, whatever. So only after they win the Olympic medal, she was allowed to eat biryani. She was till then eating only protein diet. Finally, what happens when you reduce your weight 50% and then you are off the diet, and you feel good, now I've reduced, I will stop all this diet. What will happen? Suddenly, you have to take protein supplements. It's that bad because the body is so addicted to the protein. So you have to take supplements, otherwise the weight will come on again. So that is protein diet. So in effect, you have to give a balanced diet. Balanced deficit diets are best that reduce carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And the energy deficit should be 500 calories per day. And that if you just lose that much per day, you will lose half a kg per week. So how will you do it? See, if you just cut off your rice and you take 4 chocolates or 2 burfis, it's as good as missing your meal. They say that we don't eat, but then they go and take 4 chocolates, and what's the point? 4 chapatis, 280 calories. With that, if you have just the heat's only 50 calories and dal is only 106, chicken curry is only maybe 320. That means, it's not that high. But instead, these girls, they go and take a burger, 500, boom, gone. Bun, shake, banana shake, 400 gone. Chana Bhatura, 400 gone. Chicken korma, 800 gone. This is a high protein and you take chicken korma, you are putting on so much of weight. So this is the substitution of food is what is necessary, not just cutting off your rice. That's not going to, that's not enough. That's the main thing. You have to substitute your diet and the girls have to be taught to substitute rather than avoid diet because that just makes it. So what will you substitute? You say fruits and vegetables. Now I will just give you a list of fruits which are supposed to decrease the inflammatory potential that comes with obesity. You know, this has all come from authentic journals. Huh? It's found that lychee water extract improved the metabolic profile of rats. It is good for rats, it's good for humans. No, that's what we all think at least. Total cholesterol, triglycerides, fatty acids, everything will go down with your lychee fruit. Maybe we can also start eating it just like rats. We'll also, cool down. Guava, there are many studies for, some studies against, maybe because some guavas are sweet and some are not that sweet. Maybe that difference is there. But they say it is high glycemic index, but this obesity journal has got this thing that guava is good. Ambaranga is in Malayalam, Ambati Mara in other languages, Kadu Amte, Pulichakai, whatever it is, this is supposed to be good to reduce obesity. Jackfruit, I was very surprised because our physician always says jackfruit season, diabetes goes bad. And but it is supposed to improve glucose tolerance, especially the seed actually. Forget the seeds. If you can make some vada or something like that with the jackfruit seeds, you can reduce your weight and you can reduce your inflammatory levels and everything. It's easily available in Kerala at least in season, that is. Mangosteen, that's also available. It has got an anti-inflammatory property and reduce C-reactive protein levels in humans, not only rats. And it has got an antioxidant property again. Cacti fruit, goji berries, this we don't have here. Pomegranate is very easily available. Whichever city you go, you'll find it. Of course, you would expect that somebody else peels it for you. No, it's so easy if somebody else does it for you. It will improve the key markers that lead to development of type 2 diabetes, and it improved insulin sensitivity, activated insulin action and energy and metabolism, decreased hepatic triglycerol, whatever it is, MUFA, decreased triglycerides, and it's got an antioxidant property. So you substitute your diet with all these things, your stomach will be full and you have less insulin. Avocado is as available in supermarkets. It's called makkan phal in Hindi. Malayalam, it's called atachaka or venneparam. And Kannada, benna phala, whatever. You can put it on net and see. I've eaten this. It's a very tasteless thing. No wonder it's called butter fruit because it does not got. It's like butter has no taste only. That's why it probably doesn't have any calories, But it improves lipid profile and adequately maintain glycemic control in patients with type 2 diabetes. Only thing is, it's very difficult to eat it. It's not that tasty, at least to my tongue. Anti-inflammatory properties there and antioxidant properties there. Persimmon, we can only see pictures. Bakul fruit is available everywhere now. We see the streets. This also is a Japanese food. So now we go on from these fruits and we decide what happens in PCOD. There is that insulin receptor has gone wonky, serine phosphorylation occurs. So what happens? There is resistance. Insulin is not allowed to act anyway. So there is too much of insulin. So if there is too much of insulin, we are quite happy with it. No, we are not. This insulin is welcomed by the ovarian stroma. Ovarian stroma gets the insulin, it just accepts it like sponge and makes a lot of androgens. And this androgens are a problem for us. So we either try to reduce the insulin, and why that receptors are wonky, because there is a deficiency of D-chiro-inositol. So either you provide a lot of D-chiro-inositol so that the receptors don't go wonky, or you reduce the androgen levels. So these are two things that you can try to do. So now there are a lot of foodstuffs, which are supposed to be actually doing it. This is methika seeds. This we all know, fenugreek seeds. One menopause group in 2019 have actually studied 90 premenopausal women diagnosed with PCOS. and they were studied for 90 consecutive days. Now you can believe the study, because when we quote 500 people and 1,000 people and 5,000 people, I never believe these characters. When they say we have studied 50, 90 people, you can really believe it. So I think it must be true. So the fenugreek seed, comes from Pakistan, by the way. But fenugreek seeds were thoroughly washed, dried, grounded, and they put it in bottles. And one group was given your OC pill, another group was given 5 gram of this, and another group was given 10 gram. And they found improvement in menstrual cyclicity and ovulatory function was observed in all groups. And it was observed more in the 10 gram group. Okay, that means, and there 93% of patients had secured regular menstrual cycle, almost equivalent to the rosy pill wala group. You understand? So that means just your methi seeds 10 gram powdered in that study, washed, thoroughly dried and all that. But maybe you can try doing that even without all that, You can try some other method and give these methi seeds, it will work. Now, another thing is licorice. Licorice is called Erythrimadam in Malayalam. I don't know what it's called in everywhere. You can put it in the Google and find out for your own language. Now, 3.5 gram of this commercial preparation of licorice. We all know that it's difficult to go and study on the raw these things because nobody is interested in it, because you won't get any profit out of selling raw materials. No? So you won't have studies on this. You will only have studies on extracts. And so there is a study on the commercial preparation of licorice given for 2 cycles. And I told you either you reduce the insulin levels or you reduce the testosterone levels. What licorice does is it reduces the total testosterone, and it is decreased gradually within 2 months. That's what they say. And after stopping it, it will return to pre-treatment levels. That's not very nice, but that's what happens. So if you want to continuously have decreased testosterone, you have to continuously eat this. It's not a very tasty thing, I know, but yes, that's how it is. And it can reduce serum testosterone, probably due to the block of 17-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and 17-20 lysase. So they've really found out what it is all about. Now your jeera, that sauce that we always have in all the restaurants and many of our houses, it's got estrogenic effects of, so the Goras have actually extracted it. We always have extracts to study. You give just soap, they can't do that. So what happened? They studied it on the rats. We always study on the rats because we don't want the rats. And the weight of the female genital organs of the rat, like, what all, mammary glands, oviduct, endometrium, everything has been true. And they found that per kg body weight, when they gave 100 to 200 milligram for 5 days, it significantly increased the number of total follicles of the ovary, like Graafian, antral, multilaminar follicles, whatever. And it also reduced the serum estrogen levels and thickness of the uterine endometrial cells in the rat. The rat uterus looks like our tube. We used to see that, no, when we used to go for our endoscopy training programs in the 90s. Pigs and all, they have very tiny things, no, they have. And increased serum progesterone levels and endometrial thickness. We all infertility, if you want to treat, you need a good endometrium. No? So imagine guy telling them, you go and take a little jeera and your endometrium. I wish it would have been so easy, no, but it doesn't happen. But you have to think over it. No? This is just coming 2019 on rats, maybe in 2029 in human beings. Let's hope so. And you just go on giving them fennel seeds and you can get better endometrium. What fun. Cinnamon, they've actually studied only on 15 women. Fertility study, the Pandits of all journals, they've studied it. 15 women with PCOS were randomized to daily oral cinnamon and placebo for 8 weeks, and comparison of post-treatment to baseline insulin sensitivity indices using fasting and 2-hour glucose tolerance test. I'm not telling you what all the indices are, you will get bored. That's why I did not put it in the slide. But they have particular indices, and actually they found that the insulin resistance decreases in the cinnamon group, but not in the placebo group. So you can tell them to powder it and you put it in a bottle and take a little pinch of it and eat it every day, and that will help them reduce insulin sensitivity. That may be good. Green tea has been very widely publicized, and I don't think I have to really talk much on green tea here. it will definitely improve your things. Now, pumpkin seeds, it contains omega-3 fatty acids that can help manage high cholesterol and high insulin levels seen in PCOS. And they also contain beta-sitosterol that can remove excess of androgens and treat the hirsutism. So it will better, it is acting on the androgens, right? Omega-3 fatty acids. And the weight gain reduces, symptoms of PCOS reduces. Now, there are sunflower seeds. Sesame seeds also supposed to reduce weight, and almonds also. Now you are going to ask me how much to take. We really, the studies which I saw didn't have it, but a wonderful study from Christian Medical College of Chennai and Kodaikanal, Chennai, Tamil Nadu. They have actually studied, they gave flax seeds 40 gram, walnuts 20 grams, sesame 10 gram, and sunflower seeds 15 gram. Altogether, one mutti barke, one fistful of all these things. If you give, what happens? Fenugreek seeds, pumpkin seeds, everything they put one handful and they give the patients. And what happened? Fasting insulin levels reduced drastically. Fasting glucose levels reduced. LH and FSH reduced. But that's why LH-FSH ratio was not affected because both are reduced. No? TSH also not markedly reduced. But definitely if you give a mutti for, one fistful of all these things to everybody, probably it will help. And this is the studies that are coming up. And we should, you should respect these studies that say that these things will help. Now we know that Accord and Accord Obese is marketed by Shield Healthcare, and why it contains myoinositol, which is very costly. From where do they get the myoinositol? And to extract it and give it to you in those 2 grams sachets, it's going to be very difficult. But they must be finding it from meat sources and eggs. But the meat source, the cow should be eating grass and nothing else, chemical-free sources. Fruit sources of inositol include oranges, peaches, and pears. Potassium-rich foods like banana. Of course, don't take it as a shake like I told you earlier, but take only the banana part of it. It will have inositol. Grains are also there, high in inositol, and in whole grains, not processed, refined grains. So you have to have unprocessed grains. Legumes and sprouts are also considered as foods high in inositol. Vegetables like bell peppers, I don't know what that is. Tomatoes, potatoes, asparagus, along with green leafy vegetables are also good sources of inositol. So you take your green leafy vegetables, will not only get inositol, you will also reduce your weight. And plus also nuts and seeds also contain a good amount of inositol. So if you take all these inositol things and you eat it instead of your rice and your burger and your shakes and everything, you will have a cure for PCOD and plus reduce your weight if you are not a thing. Now we know that it's not just weight reduction. That's why I told you all these drugs to reduce the androgen levels. Even in non-obese PCOS, all these, things are important because it's not just weight reduction, it reduces androgen levels. We always, this representatives, and also in the literature, we say chromium is also important. So I just checked up which are the foods containing chromium. Broccoli we don't have, but it's there in most of the supermarkets, somehow or the other. Beans are there everywhere, and liver is supposed to be having chromium. So these are the sources of chromium. With all this, I am sorry, and before time I have finished my talk. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. So now are there any questions or should we discuss this some out? Dr. Madhuri and Dr. Pratibha, what do you do in your practice to, for this?
I think let us all three finish the talk and then probably we can have the question answers. Pratibha, what do you say?
Okay, fine. Shall we go on with Pratibha? Can we have the...
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
I think we should finish our talks first.
Yes, that would be great. Just because I finished time before time, no, that's why I thought we can have some.
It was an excellent talk.
Okay.
So we'll go over to Pratibha ma'am.
Dr. Pratibha.
Yeah.
Pratibha.
Yeah. So, hello. Yeah.
Yes, Pratibha.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you
okay.
just make me the presenter so that I can share my screen?
You are the
Chitrikala?
presenter, Pratibha. Maybe you have
You
to
have to
open your
make
shares.
her co-host.
Yeah, you're already co-host, ma'am. You can share the
Okay.
slides.
Maybe you have to open in your presentation itself. You say share screen, then it will be allowed to be shared on your
Yeah.
computer.
Can
Yes,
you see?
now you're sharing. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's a, yeah. So, very good evening to all of you. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Vidya Madam and Dr. Shobna Madam for including me in this webinar, and Shields Healthcare for taking this initiative. And today I'll be talking on a very different subject. We were just discussing about the nutrition in PCOS. I'm talking something different, and the topic of my talk today is prediction in ovarian reserve. Now, the treatment of infertility can be an emotional and financial struggle for many couples. Now, although infertility treatment has come long way, but one thing is constant and very valid concern, that is the success of the treatment. This is because every infertile couple, when they come to us, their first and foremost query is, what is the success rate? And for that, over the years, physicians have tried to evaluate couples' fertility treatment success prior to undergoing treatment so that it can give them a true sense of probability of achieving pregnancy and to some extent reduce their stress. And it is an established fact that with increasing in the age, there is increase in the subfertility, which is mainly due to decrease in the ovarian reserve. So prediction of ovarian reserve is very important. And it is mainly defined as number and the quality of remaining follicles and oocyte in both ovaries at a given age. And what is ovarian reserve when it is considered normal? It is when the exogenous gonadotropin stimulation results in development and retrieval of at least 8 to 10 follicles. Now, prediction of ovarian reserve can be done by this ovarian reserve testing. And the main goal of this test is to identify those individuals who are at risk of diminished or decreased ovarian reserve. Although it cannot predict, these tests, they cannot predict the end of any of one's reproductive years, but it can definitely encourage the individuals to pursue more aggressive treatment options before it becomes late. Because when the test results suggest diminished ovarian reserve, it is always fairly reasonable to counsel such women that their window of opportunity to conceive may be shorter than what they have anticipated, and so they should be encouraged to conceive sooner rather than later. This is mainly because these women who are with diminished ovarian reserve, normally they have regular menses, so they always think that everything is normal. But minded, there is decrease in these females, there is a decreased quantity of ovarian follicles, which may result into limited response to ovarian stimulation with fertility medications, and thereby will reduce the fecundity. Now, ovarian reserve is often viewed by patient as either a good or a bad news. And this is mainly because now the scenario is changing. Now, women elect to postpone their first pregnancy to a later stage in life. Maybe they are getting married at the later age, or they are busy planning their career, or if they get married also and if they are pregnant also, there is an easy availability of contraceptive methods and safe abortion, so they postpone their pregnancies. And sometimes they are in false dilemma that there is so much advancement in the field of infertility that whenever they will come to an infertility specialist, they will become pregnant. But minded, if they want their own biological child, then there is a fixed time period of 10 years between age at loss of natural fertility and menopause. So an argument for universal screening of all women can be made, but ideally ovarian reserve testing can be more strongly be justified for the women who are above the age of 35 years, or where there is unexplained infertility regardless of age, or where there is a family history of early menopause of premature ovarian failure, or where there is a ovarian pathology like endometriosis, PID, ovarian neoplasm, there is a decreased oocyte yield, or when the patient has or the female has undergone some previous ovarian surgeries like ovarian cystectomy, laparoscopic ovarian drilling, or unilateral oophorectomy. Now, I don't know about the metros, but in cities like Bhagalpur, where still these type of tumors are dealt by surgeons, many a times we see very young girls, they come where unilateral or sometimes bilateral oophorectomy has been done. I have seen 3-4 patients like this who is just 21 or 22-year-old, and this has been done. So they should be counseled and they should be monitored. That is very important. And people should know that that is not the treatment at that age. Now, there are also those females, young females who have cancer survivors, where there is a history of chemotherapy or radiation, or those who are chronic smokers, or those where there is a poor response to exogenous gonadotropin stimulation. All these patients should go for, at least they should be counseled for ovarian reserve testing. Now, these are the list of tests for ovarian reserve tests, but one thing which I want to tell you here, that these tests should be only used as a screening test for counseling purpose, and to direct further diagnostic steps like first IVF attempt to observe the response to ovarian stimulation. They should never be done as a diagnostic test. And the first biological test is this age, which is the single most important factor. As we all know that as the age increases, there is decrease in oocytes. And this diminished number starts even before the baby girl is born. That is, during 20 weeks of gestation, a female embryo contains about 7 million eggs. And when she is born, it drops to about 2 to 4 lakhs. So age-related decline in female fertility is well recognized, which starts at 30 years, rapidly declines after 37 years, and virtually becomes zero at 43 years. And this is mainly due to decrease in oocyte quantity and quality. Now, I think whosoever talk on ovarian reserve, this is the slide which everybody shares, and that is which shows the relation of age with number of follicles and poor oocyte quality. So as the age advances, the number of follicles decreases, and there is an increase in the proportion of poor quality oocytes. Also, as the age advances, there is increase in the miscarriage rate from 15% at the age of 30 to 52% at the age of 40. And this is mainly because of abnormal eggs or aneuploidies. Like in young women, the 10% eggs are aneuploid, which increases to 30% at the age of 40. At 45, it becomes 43%. And by the time female reaches at 50 years, nearly all eggs become aneuploid. So we can say that the age is the most important marker for ovarian reserve, but we need other markers also. And that is because the age of onset of decline in ovarian reserve is highly variable. So we need other markers also to predict ovarian reserve and fertility potential. Like where we have to identify the young women with diminished ovarian reserve, and also to identify those women who have an adequate ovarian reserve even at the age when natural fertility is lost. That is at the age of 39 to 40. Even I think we all see such patients. Like just I think 1.5 years back, I had one patient, she was 39 years old and she got married just 1 month back, and she was very much afraid, and she wanted to know about her fertility potential. But by the time I could do anything for her, next month only she conceived, and she had I mean, there was no problem with her, and she is a proud mother of 1 child. So sometimes this also happens. So for that, we need ovarian markers and ovarian reserve so that the management can be individualized in terms of stimulation protocol and early initiation for appropriate patient. Now, so these are the other markers, that is the hormonal test, that is biochemical markers. And out of this static marker, the first one is this follicle stimulating hormone, which is usually measured between the day 2 to day 3 of the cycle. And when the level is more than 10 international units per liter, it shows the poor response to ART. And the women who are above the age of 30 with one value of FSH more than 14 international unit per liter do worse on IVF. But they should not be excluded from IVF treatment because there are a lot of pitfalls with these levels. There is monthly variation, there is sometimes lab-wise variation also, and there is also a spurious fall after some hormonal therapy. Now, FSH is a potential for quantity of egg, whereas age is a potential for quality of egg. So good quantity of egg and the early age gives a good number of embryos, which results into increased delivery rates. Now the second marker is this serum estradiol. Here the combined E2 and FSH levels are better than E2 alone. If E2 levels are more than 80 picogram per ml on day 3, then that is considered as a higher IVF cancellation rate, as it reflects advanced follicular development due to poor ovarian reserve. But it is mainly useful in the condition when day 3 FSH is normal. So if the FSH is normal on day 3, but E2 levels are elevated, then these E2 levels will often be artificially suppressing FSH levels down to the normal range. So it mainly helps to interpret both FSH and E2 levels. So it is very important that we should do this combined E2 and FSH level. Now FSH and LH ratio, although it has no clinical use as an ovarian reserve marker, but it can be used as an additional predictor for decrease in ovarian reserve. If there is higher ratio on day 3, then it is associated with inferior outcome in IVF cycle, and it is also an early indicator of ovarian aging. Progesterone also does not have independent role in assessment of ovarian reserve, but early LH surge and elevation of P4 may be the sign of poor ovarian reserve. So on day 3, the progesterone level should be less than 1.5 nanogram per ml, and on mid-luteal phase it should be more than 10. Now inhibin B has come in very big way, and it is a direct biomarker of ovarian reserve similar to AMH. If the level is more than 45 picogram per ml, then it shows a poor response to induction. It is mainly produced from small antral follicles and selectively inhibits FSH release as it has central negative feedback. Now, as we all know that the follicular cohort size decreases with age. So there is a decrease in inhibin level, which is prior to the increase in FSH level. But again, there are high false positive rate, so not widely used nowadays, because we have the better marker, and that is this AMH, which is a focus for the future ovarian reserve assessment. Now, it is mainly produced by granulosa cell of growing preantral and small antral follicles, highest being the follicle of less than 4 millimeter. Its production decreases or stops once the size reaches to 8 millimeter. And so the levels are usually constant, and therefore this test or AMH can be tested at any time during the women's cycle. So you need not wait for day 3 or day 2 of the cycle. It can be done anytime. So AMH helps define patient subgroup. It highly correlates with ovarian response. About 97% it has sensitivity in predicting poor response, whereas 98% accuracy in predicting normal response. The normal responders, the level is between 2 to 3.5 nanogram per ml, whereas in the poor responder, it should be less than 1 nanogram, whereas in the hyper responder, it should be more than 3.5 nanogram. So it helps in individualizing the treatment plan. It is useful in screening tests in women at high risk of diminished ovarian reserve, but has a limited benefit for those who have low risk of diminished ovarian reserve. It also helps in reduction of the both excessive response and the cancellation of the cycle. Also helps know the reduced risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Also helps in increasing the pregnancy and live birth rates. And also for the obesity, it may be associated with decreased ovarian reserve. So an obese woman have 65% lower AMH levels than thin women. So when the obese patient comes to you, she should be advised for lifestyle modification and to reduce weight before she go for infertility treatment. So currently AMH is the best available marker in terms of sensitivity and specificity as compared to others. It is more sensitive predictor of ovarian response to control ovarian hyperstimulation. Its level reflects oocyte quantity rather than quality. It plays a role in the initial recruitment and the selection of the dominant follicle. It reflects non-FSH dependent follicular growth. No, it is non-cycle dependent, so it can be measured on any day, any time. It is not altered after hormonal therapy or after downregulation with GnRH agonist. And it has no inter-observer variation as seen in antral follicle count, which is operator dependent. The only problem with AMH test is that it has an optimal storage and handling condition issues, and it has does not have any standardization. So there is an urgent need to prepare international reference preparations to make test results comparable. Until then, we should need to be careful in translating AMH cutoff values from studies to our clinical practice. So for interpretation of AMH blood levels, high is considered when it is more than 3 nanogram per ml, and if it is between 3 to 1 nanogram, it is considered as normal. When it is between 0.7 to 0.9 nanogram, it is low normal range. 0.3 to 0.6 nanogram per ml, it is low. And when it is less than 0.3 nanogram per ml, it is very low. So decreased AMH level mainly is an indicator of poor response in IVF. Then it has other advantage also. It is increasingly valuable in assessing ovarian reserve for young women with cancer. Measuring AMH level before and after chemotherapy allows detection of differences in ovarian toxicity among chemotherapy regimen and also help to evaluate long-term ovarian function. As it is secreted from granulosa cell, AMH assay can aid in diagnosis and also for the follow-up of ovarian granulosa cell tumor. And post-operatively also, it can be used as a marker for efficacy of surgery and for disease recurrence. For young cancer survivors, AMH assay before and after cancer treatment may be useful who are concerned after fertility, about fertility potential. Usually the levels drop during chemotherapy with certain amount of recovery after 2 to 6 months. But ultimately the main goal of AMH assay in young cancer survivor would be to predict the long-term reproductive outcome. Now, these are the dynamic tests which are not very popular because it has an additional cost and it is not very patient friendly, but we are doing, sometimes we need to see these tests also, and this include clomiphene citrate challenge test, which is a dynamic type of test that can discover some cases of poor ovarian reserve that are still showing a normal day 3 FSH level. Now, how it is done? On day 3, FSH and E2 levels are done. Then patient is given 100 milligrams of clomiphene citrate from day 5 to day 9. Then again FSH level is measured on day 10. The normal clomiphene citrate challenge test result in low FSH on day 3, low E2 level on day 3, and also low FSH on day 10. Now the underlying assumption for this test to work is that in a woman with adequate ovarian reserve, there is a healthy developing follicular cohort that should be able to produce enough inhibin and estradiol to suppress FSH and resist the clomiphene citrate stress on hypothalamo-pituitary axis. Now, if FSH level on day 3 is already elevated, then you need not perform these tests. Now, second test is this GnRH agonist stimulation test, which can evaluate the changes in E2 levels on cycle day 2 and day 3 following subcutaneous administration of GnRH agonist. And this dose causes massive and temporary release of FSH and LH from pituitary, which in turn increases E2 level production within 24 hours time frame. So this robust increase or flare up of E2 level in response to this stimulation is reflective of recruitable follicles in the early follicular phase, which in turn is representative of good ovarian reserve. Now, another test is this exogenous FSH ovarian reserve test. It measures serum estradiol level in response to 300 units of FSH administered on day 3 of the cycle. Now again, E2 levels are checked after 24 hours, and the increase of E2 level of more than 30 picogram per ml predicts response in IVF. It has less intercycle variability, but again, it has no proven benefit. There are few home fertility tests are also available where the females can directly go and take it on the over the counter, but they are not FDA approved and should not be promoted. Now, ultrasound is a biophysical marker and plays a bigger role for all physical evaluation techniques for ovarian reserve prediction. Now, it is done during the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle for the measurement of ovarian volume, the mean ovarian diameter, the antral follicle count, and the ovarian stromal blood flow with color Doppler. So first parameter, which is most important, is this antral follicle count. It is defined as a number of follicles between 2 to 10 millimeters in diameter detected by transvaginal sonography in early follicular phase, that is between day 2 to day 5 of the cycle. Now, antral follicle count has been shown to be predictor of the number of oocytes retrieved in controlled ovarian hyperstimulation protocol, also helps to predict the cancellation rates in IVF or loss in IVF pregnancies, and also for predicting pregnancy, and also for predicting number of immature oocytes retrieved for in vitro maturation. And here you have to understand that the number of pre-antral or small antral follicles, that is those follicles which are between 2 to 6 millimeter diameter, usually decline with age, and the number of large follicles, that is between 7 to 10 millimeter, remain constant. So this suggests that the number of small antral follicle represent the functional ovarian reserve. And this can be used as a screening test for possible poor responders for directing further diagnostic steps like first IVF attempt, where the ovarian response to hyperstimulation will provide additional information. Now, another parameter is the ovarian volume, where 3D ultrasound is better than 2D. It has inter-observer variation, and standalone it is not eligible. Whereas ovarian Doppler, again, it can assess ovarian blood flow, and some suggest that it can show the highest vascularity, which is quite good in the early follicular phase, which can be a prognostic sign. But at present, it has no clinical value because of different flow derived predictors. There were many studies which had come, which has compared transvaginal sonography as with the hormonal parameters for ovarian determination. And this Adam et al., he suggested that transvaginal sonography rather than hormonal parameters is the preferred method for ovarian reserve determination. PVS assessment of ovarian volume and the antral follicle count confers a strong correlation with chronological aging than day 3 FSH level indices and aging. But cycle to cycle consistency of both the antral follicle count and ovarian volume has been demonstrated to be significantly variable in young subfertile women. So a low antral follicle count in young subfertile ovulatory women should be interpreted cautiously, as a low antral follicle count may not reflect poor ovarian reserve and is not a predictive of failure to conceive. So whatever tests we have seen just now, although these tests are predictive of poor ovarian response, but usually not recommended. They are just for the counseling and not for the diagnostic purpose, as it is not predictive of failure to conceive. The final response is by assessing the ovarian response to a maximal stimulation in first ART cycle. Now, if you get a poor response at that time, then that is a proof of decreased ovarian reserve. So to conclude, the primary goal of ovarian reserve testing is to identify women at risk of diminished ovarian reserve, and the secondary goal is for individualizing the treatment strategies. Although these tests may predict ovarian response to infertility treatment, but they are not reliably predict the failure to conceive. There are several methods developed to estimate functional or biological age of ovary, but there is no single reliable test to assess ovarian reserve. Most of the ovarian reserve tests are not suitable to exclude patients, but they are only used as a screening test for counseling purposes. Since ovarian reserve can vary over time, as Results suggest that limited ovarian reserve should be confirmed by further testing, particularly in the young ovulating females. Then combination of tests are better than single test, like antral follicle count with basal FSH and age, or age with antral follicle count and AMH. But ultimately, the first IVF attempt may be the step of choice which can assess actual response to hyperstimulation. And the true challenges for ovarian reserve testing lies in the possibility of identifying those young women who have a reduced reproductive lifespan so that adequate action can be taken. Secondly, the prognosis of abnormal ovarian reserve test in young women is generally poor. But on the contrary, prognosis of the women with normal test or usually mainly relates with the age. So a normal test does not always result, does not always improve the poorer age-specific prognosis for older women. So those females who are compromised or have low ovarian reserve, it is important to point out that likelihood of the success with infertility treatment is low. So that in advance, they should be considered other options like donor treatment or adoption. But many times when you tell them, it is not accepted to them. And so the course of action should be, do not give them false hope, help the couple to reevaluate their parenthood and determine if any other option they might pursue. Because in the world of infertility, if one door is shut, another opens. The door may not reveal what the couple thought they wanted, but it might reveal something that is even better. So thank you for patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratibha. You ended on a nice talk and sentence, but then you are scaring us saying that if ovarian reserve is poor, the patient is all doomed and everything. And in the end, you say one door, two door, three door, whatever.
Yeah, there are. Yes, madam, there are door opens. Yeah. Like those who want to delay their childbearing.
Pratibha, you will stop your screen share, and by the time Dr. Madhuri Patil will finish her talk, I'm giving you one simple question. You are only talking about IVF people. We are all plain infertility people who are not doing IVF. Please tell us what we are supposed to do, and you prepare that answer by the time Dr. Madhuri Patil finishes her talk. Okay. For SADA, GP, IVF, GP, non-IVF fertility specialists like us. You know? Okay, Dr. Madhuri, over to you. Dr. Madhuri has already been introduced, so I won't be doing that. Anyway, everybody knows her. So, Dr. Madhuri from Patil's Infertility and Endoscopies.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I thank Dr. Vidya Thobi for inviting me today to speak and Shield Pharmaceuticals on ovulation induction in PCOS. So basically, we know that almost 1 in 10 of the women are being affected by PCOS, and of these, about 30 to 40% of them are infertile, and about 5 to 10% require IVF. So this is a very good slide which shows you a diagnostic algorithm because it has changed over the years. We no longer today follow the Rotterdam criteria, and what we use is the international PCOS guidelines. So if a woman has irregular cycles and clinical hypoandrogenism, it is diagnostic of PCOS. If there is no clinical hypoandrogenism, then we need to test for biochemical hypoandrogenism, and if it is positive with irregular cycles, it's diagnostic. And if only one is present, that is either she has irregular cycles or she has signs of hypoandrogenemia, either clinical or biochemical, then only an ultrasound is required. And if it has a PCOS morphology, then it is diagnostic of PCOS. So basically, we have several extra ovarian factors basically the environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals, the lifestyle, which all result in either dyslipidemia with inflammation, increased DHEAS level, increased insulin levels, high LH but low FSH levels, and all these together act on the ovaries to result in chronic anovulation. And in the ovary itself, we have several factors which are either decreased or increased, and this result in chronic anovulation. So the basic biochemical, metabolic, and endocrine changes which are present in the PCOS is obesity and insulin resistance. And what the insulin resistance does, it is interrelated to obesity, plus it results in decrease in sex hormone binding globulin with high androgen and pre-androgen levels. And it also has an action on the ovarian stroma when it increases the action of LH on the theca cells, resulting again in increase in androgen production. Obesity basically results in aromatization in the adipose tissue of estrogens to androgens. It also results in increased plasma estron level, not the estradiol level, increase FSH and decrease LH, and all these together result in anovulation with reproductive impairment in women with PCOS. And when we stimulate this woman, we have an unpredictable response. The response may be slow. There could be either hyper response with ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, and there is also an increased risk of cyst formation. So there are two guidelines which are used for evidence when we talk about ovulation induction in PCOS, and one is the International Evidence-Based Guidelines for entire management of PCOS, and I think this is a very, very good document which all of you all should read. And the other is ovarian stimulation for IVF and ICSI, but I think for general OBGYNs, this might not be of much use, but this document is really worth reading, and it's going to give you a lot of insight into PCOS. So when we look at the treatment of infertility in PCOS, so we have different options with us, and the first option is always a non-pharmacological treatment, which of diet and exercise. And I think Dr. Shobna has very well discussed the diet, and she's discussed more about the positivity than the negativity. And I think that is very less known, and I think it was a very, very good talk. Then we have the first line pharmacological management, which includes the aromatase inhibitors, which could be either in the form of letrozole or in the form of anastrozole, or we have selective estrogen receptor modulators like clomiphene citrate and tamoxifen. Gonadotropins with or without GnRH analogs is usually the second line of pharmacological treatment, and laparoscopic ovarian drilling is also treated as a second line treatment, and IVF with either agonist or antagonist is a third line of intervention. Coming to lifestyle, it's already been discussed. So just in 3 sentences, I would like to say that we need to avoid junk food and try to eat healthy, include physical activity in your routine, wherein at least you exercise 5 times a week for at least 30 minutes a day, and you sleep adequately and at a proper schedule. Coming to ovarian stimulation, so basically for timed intercourse and for intrauterine insemination, that is what we require is a in vivo conception, and therefore we cannot control the number of eggs ovulated, fertilized and implanted, and therefore the incidence of multiple pregnancies is much higher, and it is not under our control. But whereas in IVF, it is an in vitro conception, and we can prevent multiple pregnancies by doing a single embryo transfer. So before we go in for ovulation induction, we should know what our goals are. So whether the patient is anovulatory and it's for ovulation induction, wherein you want a single dominant follicle, or basically she either has anovulation or a normal cycle and it is for ovarian stimulation, and she's for IVF, and therefore we want multiple follicular development. And the number of follicles which will ovulate is determined by the length of time the FSH remains above threshold value of the follicles. So when we talk about ovulation induction, it is very important for us that we need to maximize the beneficial effects with the birth of a singleton baby and minimize the complications and risk will decrease the cycle cancellation due to either poor response or ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, multiple pregnancies and ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And when we select the protocol, it is basically based on individualized parameters of the ovarian reserve test, which was very well discussed by Dr. Pratibha. And what we consider today is the age, the AMH, and the antral follicular count. And this is amended further for the BMI. So according to both the international guidelines and the ASHRAE guidelines, it is important to do the risk assessment for high response. And what we take into consideration when we look at the PCOS patient is the antral follicular count and anti-Mullerian hormone, and none of the other tests are really taken into account or recommended to be done. And is there any influence of patient characteristics? So BMI has no effect either on the AMH or the antral follicular count, but age does have. It is not going to change our antral follicular count, but it results in a lower accuracy for AMH to predict the response. So then what is the aim of ovulation induction? Basically, it is in an anovulatory woman with PCOS, it is basically to restore monoovulation. And when it is important that we must inform the woman and discuss the evidence, the possible concern and side effects of treatment. And it's important to exclude pregnancy prior to ovulation induction if the woman is amenorrheic, and unsuccessful and prolonged use of oral ovulation should be avoided due to poor success rate, and use of ovulation induction agents like letrozole, metformin and clomiphene citrate are off-label in many countries as pharmaceutical companies have not applied for their approval in PCOS, and therefore these countries basically use more of gonadotrophins for ovulation induction. So the prerequisite before ovulation induction is that you have to do a scan on day 2 and 3 of the cycle. And at this stage, the follicular size has to be the most largest follicle has to be less than 10 millimeters in size. There has to be absence of ovarian cells, and the endometrial thickness has to be less than 6 millimeters. And most of the drugs should be started on day 2 or 3 of the menstrual cycle, as the selection of the dominant follicle happens early in the follicular phase. And the dose of these drugs should be tailored to each individual depending upon their ovarian reserve test. Coming to aromatase inhibitors, which is the first line of treatment, we know that it has 3 mechanisms of action. One is that it's an aromatase inhibitor, so it inhibits the estrogen synthesis and therefore enhances the GnRH positivity, and consequently the FSH and inhibin stimulation and secretion happens. Locally in the ovary, the androgens which are produced augment the follicular FSH receptor expression, because the androgens are not converted to estrogens, and therefore the intra-ovarian environment of the ovary is become more hypoandrogenic, and this results in amplifying the FSH effect on the early follicular growth. It also induces intrafollicular level growth factor 1 concentrations, which synergizes with the action of FSH. It is usually used in the dose of 2.5 to 5 milligrams from day 2 to 7, or a single dose of 20 milligrams on day 3 can be used. In India, basically it's licensed to be used only in the dose of 2.5 milligrams, but most of us, I know we use 5 milligrams, but you should know that it is licensed to be used only in the dose of 2.5 milligrams. Anastrozole basically is given in the dose of 1 milligram from day 3 to 7, and the estrogen suppression peaks between 5 to 7 days of the cycle, and after day 7 the E2 level rises so that it can trigger the LH surge around day 12 to 14, and this rise is not supraphysiological because of its aromatase inhibitor activity, which is seen with clomiphene citrate. Moreover, there is no anti-estrogenic effect seen on the endometrium and cervical mucosa as with clomiphene citrate, and a limited number of mature follicles are formed, and there is a decreased incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome and multiple pregnancies. And if you look at this paper which was published, you can look at the live birth rate. You can see that it is much higher with clomiphene citrate. And when you look at the different BMIs, that is less than 30, between 30 to 39 and more than 39, you can see that letrozole is much better than clomiphene citrate in resulting in live birth rates. And you can see as the weight increases, the live birth rate also decreases. And you can also see that time to pregnancy is much less when you use letrozole as compared to clomiphene citrate. So the Cochrane review also in 2014 says that letrozole improved the live birth rate and pregnancy rate in subfertile women with anovulatory PCOS as compared to CC. And there is no difference in the effectiveness between letrozole and laparoscopic ovarian drilling. And they also concluded that the occurrence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome was very rare when letrozole was used as compared to clomiphene citrate. In 2017, this double-blinded RCT was carried out, and this concluded that the superiority of letrozole over clomiphene citrate as a primary ovulation induction agent in PCOS women, with 40% increase in the pregnancy rates and a shorter time to pregnancy, and therefore it has been replaced as the first line of treatment in women with PCOS. And according to the international guidelines also, the letrozole is used as a first-line drug, and only in those countries where letrozole is not available or is not permitted or the cost is prohibited, then other agents can be used. And it also concluded that, as I told you earlier, the risk of multiple pregnancies is much less. Coming to anti-estrogens or selective estrogen receptor modulators like clomiphene citrate, we know that it can be started on any day between 2 to 5 of the cycle. The ovulation rate and the pregnancy rates are similar regarding the day of starting of the treatment. The dose varies, the starting dose varies from 50 to 100 milligrams, and the maximum dose of 150 milligrams can be given. The dose basically correlates with the body weight, the age, and its indication for use, as well as the past response, and it cannot be predicted accurately, and it requires an empirical increment titration to establish the lowest effective dose, and the treatment should be discontinued if 2 consecutive cycles are anovulatory. Tamoxifen is used in the dose of 20 milligrams or 40 milligrams from day 2 to 3 of the cycle. It can be combined along with clomiphene citrate, wherein you use 50 milligrams of clomiphene citrate and you use 20 milligrams of tamoxifen from day 2 to 6 of the cycle, and it is discontinued if the cycles are anovulatory with a maximum dose of 40 milligrams. Tamoxifen, one must remember, is not the first line of treatment in patients with adequate endometrium, but it is a promising alternative to clomiphene citrate for ovarian stimulation in those patients who have failed to develop an adequate endometrial thickness in a previous ovulation induction cycle. So according to the international guidelines, CC could be used alone in women with PCOS to improve ovulation and pregnancy rates, but the risk of multiple pregnancies is much higher, and therefore the most important thing is monitoring of an ovulation induction cycle is necessary when clomiphene citrate is used. So why is CC not the first line choice of first line of treatment? Because CC results in elevated plasma concentrations of FSH and LH, and when it is administered in a normal cycling woman, the LH pulse frequency but not the amplitude increasing suggests that there is increase in the hypothalamic GnRH pulse frequency. But in women with PCOS who already have a high LH frequency at the baseline, the administration of CC results in increase in the LH pulse amplitude with increase in daily plasma concentrations of LH and FSH, and this is then detrimental to the ovulation as well as to the oocyte quality. CC also acts as a estrogen agonist, and therefore it enhances the stimulation of LH receptor formation in the granulosa cells. It has a direct effect in the ovary and on the ovary, but the exact mechanism and effect is still not known properly, and it also acts as an anti-estrogenic effect on the uterus, cervix, as well as the vagina. So when do we stop these oral ovulation agents? One is when 6 ovulatory cycles have failed to yield a pregnancy, when there is no ovulation with maximum dose of letrozole, that is 5 milligrams or 150 milligrams with clomiphene citrate, and if the endometrial thickness is less than 7 millimeters at ovulation in a clomiphene citrate cycle. We can improve the results if we monitor these patients for the anti-estrogenic effects, especially when we are using clomiphene citrate. We decrease the insulin levels with weight loss and insulin lowering medications. We use adjuvants like HCG, dexamethasone when DHEAS is high, or dopamine agonist when there are high prolactin levels, and decrease the LH levels by pre-treatment suppression of LH and androgens with combined oral contraceptive pills or progesterone, or we perform a laparoscopic ovarian drilling. So in these instances, then we need to use gonadotrophins, wherein we can use them alone or in combination with the oral ovulagents. And when we use them in combination, basically the oral ovulagents stimulate the recruitment of number of small follicles, and the gonadotrophins sustain the growth of these recruited follicles. And gonadotrophin therapy is indicated in clomiphene, letrozole, and tamoxifen resistance or failure, when there is persistent hypersecretion of LH, the postcoital test is negative, and in patients who are undergoing IUI or ERT cycles. But it's important for us to know that it requires specific protocols and stringent monitoring, and transvaginal follicular growth and endometrial thickness should be monitored. And only in certain cases where either you have a hypo or a hyper response, we need to do the estradiol levels. So when we are using combination therapy, usually these drugs are given from day 2 or of the cycle for 5 days, and then we start the gonadotropins from day 7. Usually it's best to start them with a low dose of 37.5, but if the BMI is high, you can give 50 or 75 IU. And once the criteria for trigger is reached, that is the follicles are about 18 to 20 millimeters, we give a trigger with HCG 5000 or 250 micrograms of recombinant HCG. And if an IUI has to be done, it is done about 35 to 37 hours later. And because we are giving gonadotropins, it's important that we have to support the luteal phase with progesterone, either orally or vaginally. Then we have the low dose protocol. So in a non-ART cycle, as I told you, it's 37.5 to 75. And after 7 days, if a dominant follicle of more than 10 millimeters is not found, we can either increase the dose by 50% or 100%. And in an ART cycle, usually the dose what we start is about 100 to 150 IU. This is the most used protocol in an IUI cycle because this results in the formation of a monofollicular, results in monofollicular growth. And here, the first increase in the dose is done only on day 14 of the cycle, and the dose is increased either by 50% or 37.5 IU. And again, you repeat the scans, and the next increase in the dose is done only on day 21, that is only after 7 days. So you can keep on increasing the dose every 7 days, and the maximum dose what you can give is 225 IU. And if that does not reach, then probably you need to cancel the cycle. So according to the Cochrane review, in PCOS patients who are CC resistant or have failure, there's no evidence of difference in the live birth rates and OHSS rate between when you're using urinary or recombinant gonadotropins, and you can use either FSH or HMG. It's not necessary that you need to use only FSH in patients with PCOS. And one has to weigh, especially in countries like India, we have to weigh the cost and convenience when we choose the gonadotropins. And according to the international guidelines, as I've already told you, it's a second line of treatment. And basically, whenever available and affordable, it is used in preference to clomiphene citrate combined with metformin therapy for ovulation induction, and especially in those women who have anovulatory infertility and who are CC resistant. And it has been shown that addition of metformin could be used rather than GT alone. And though the initial report said that it only reduces the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, but the Cochrane review, as I will show you, says that it probably increases the live birth rate. And when gonadotropins are prescribed, especially in non-ART cycles, we have to look at the cost and availability, the expertise which is required for the use in ovulation induction, degree of intensive ultrasound monitoring is important. There's lack of difference in the clinical efficacy of available gonadotropin preparations. Low dose gonadotropin protocols are the best. And we have to look at the risk and implications of the potential risk of multiple pregnancy. And gonadotropin induced ovulation is triggered only when there are less than 3 mature follicles in a non-ART cycle. If they are more, either you convert it into an ART cycle and freeze all the embryos, or you cancel the cycle. So there are certain challenges now when we talk about ART, because these protocols, they have to be efficacious and safe. And at the same time, we have to prevent the follicular rise in the progesterone levels. It has to result in pregnancy. We have to prevent poor as well as hyper response, because in those women in PCOS who have a very high AMH value, because they inhibit the recruitment of the follicles, if you look at the action of AMH, it can result in poor response because of that. And these patients usually require a higher dose. And when you give a higher dose, it's just like walking on a rope. And it can just tilt the balance from poor response to hyper response. We have to decrease the multiple pregnancy rate, the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, the imprinting disorders and epigenetic abnormalities, which are very, very common when we use high dose of gonadotrophins, and also result in a better neonatal outcome. So when we consider, we have to look at the prediction of response, which was very nicely spoken just before me. We have to look at the quantity and quality of the oocytes obtained, the protocols used, the analogs used, the pre-treatment, especially in an antagonist cycle, what trigger we give, and prevention of progesterone rise, as well as ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, as well as the luteal phase support. And when we look at the type of gonadotrophin, we have already seen that we can use either the urinary or recurrent FSH, or you can also use HMG, and it really does not make any difference, and therefore there is no evidence to support that you have to use only recombinant FSH or only FSH preparations. And if you have to add an LH activity, it's not necessary that you have to add recombinant LH. You can always add HMG, because it is only increases the cost but does not increase the efficacy of treatment. And in a patient where you're using an agonist protocol, basically it's important that you need to reduce the gonadotrophin dose as compared to an antagonist protocol, because this will prevent the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. There are also protocols which use clomiphene citrate and letrozole along with gonadotrophins, and it has been seen in high responders that none of them have shown any evidence to be used in women with PCOS to increase the efficacy as well as the live birth rates. But if used, basically the clomiphene is started from day 2 and the gonadotrophins are started from day 3 of the cycle, and then antagonists are started either in a fixed protocol on day 6 or in a flexible protocol when the dominant follicle is 14 millimeters. And similarly, letrozole also is started from day 2 to the 6, and gonadotrophins from day 3. And then when we look at the agonist and the antagonist, basically in PCOS, an antagonist protocol is always recommended because it improves the safety as well as the efficacy, and basically it also reduces the duration of stimulation, the total gonadotrophin dose required, and the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. I've just added these 3 slides to tell you that there's something new which is coming in, because we know that there is always a asynchronous development of follicles when we're using the antagonist protocol. So this is a new drug called as Degarelix, which is a long-acting antagonist, which is started on day 24 or 25 of the previous cycle. And it's just a single injection, and that single injection will control your LH levels till the day of trigger which is being given. And it has seen that it results in decrease in both FSH as well as LH levels. And as soon as you stop it after the ovulation, you can see that the levels again increase in size. And there's the small study which has been conducted, which has shown that the cumulative ongoing delivery rate is much higher, but more studies are required for dosing and its efficacy and safety. Coming to trigger, we can use either recombinant HCG or urinary HCG. Both is equally effective in women with PCOS, but you have to use a reduced dose of 5,000 international units, or you can use recombinant HCG 250 micrograms, which corresponds to 6,500 international units of HCG. And agonist trigger should be used only when there is a risk of OHSS, and basically a freeze-all strategy would be much helpful. And in case, and it can be used only when you're downregulating the patient in an antagonist protocol. And what I spoke about is freeze-all is called as the segmentation protocol, where you use gonadotrophins with antagonists, give a trigger, vitrify all the embryos, and then transfer them in a subsequent cycle. It's important that many a times we require pre-treatment with GnRH antagonists for synchronization of the follicular development, prevention of occurrence of early large follicles. Also, we have to prevent the spontaneous LH surge, reduce the cyst formation, schedule the IVF cycles, and plan IVF activity to avoid work on weekends and holidays. And why is it required? So if you look at the agonist long protocol, once we start, the FSH is reduced, and the levels will increase only when you're giving the exogenous FSH. But in an antagonist protocol, we know that there is always an intercycle rise in the FSH. So what happens with this? And then again, it will reduce. And then when you're giving, it will start. And you can see once the antagonists are started, again, it reduces. So with this, what happens? You can see that there's asynchronous development. Because there is increase in the intermenstrual period, you can see some follicles have already started growing. Then there is a dip. So few of those started follicles will become apoptotic. And then when you start the FSH, basically so many follicles start growing. And once the antagonist is added, again, there is a slight dip in the FSH levels. And therefore, some follicles again will stop growing. As against in an agonist cycle, you can see that there is a uniform growth of the follicles as compared to an antagonist cycle. So what does the evidence say? Pre-treatment with estrogens basically is not recommended to improve the efficacy. And even progesterone are really not helpful. And same is with the GnRH antagonist and oral contraceptive pills. But basically, they can be used only for planning the cycle. That is so that basically in India, we can use it when you're doing batch IVF, or abroad, basically it is used to avoid weekend activity. Metformin is a good adjuvant to control ovarian stimulation. And when it's used with oral, really its efficacy is not that much. You can see that the pregnancy rates are not much different when clomiphene, if you consider clomiphene as compared to clomiphene with metformin. And just with metformin, there is hardly any live birth rate. So only because the short-term course of metformin really does not help. Then in 2014, they said that there is no conclusive evidence that metformin treatment before or during ART cycle improves the live birth rate, but it decreases the risk of OHSS. But that happens only in a GnRH agonist cycle and not in an antagonist cycle. And they said again that there's no effect in an antagonist cycle. And then came this large systemic review, which said that it is beneficial, you can see, only if the BMI is less than 30. It's less than 30 kg per square meter, whereas it is not beneficial. And this is basically when used with the oral ovulogins, it's not beneficial if the BMI is more than 30 kilograms per this thing. Then in 2017, they said that metformin definitely increases the live birth rate, but only when it is used with gonadotrophins, both in an IUI as well as an IVF cycle. And there is insufficient evidence of its use for reducing the multiple pregnancy rate as well as ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And then there was another paper which also looked at the other insulin sensitizing agents, and they said that metformin is probably beneficial over placebo, but not the other insulin sensitizing agents. And the data on metformin versus CC for live birth rate is inconclusive. Results differed by BMI, which I have already shown you. And CC resulted in improvement in the clinical pregnancy rates and ovulation as compared to metformin alone in obese women. Combined therapy is probably improved the ovulation rate as well as the clinical pregnancy rate. And women taking metformin alone or in combination, there's no evidence of increased miscarriage or gastrointestinal side effects in the dose where what we're using, that is 1000 milligrams. And according to the international guidelines, also combination of CC with metformin helps in improving the ovulation, pregnancy, as well as live birth rate. And if metformin is used for ovulation induction in obese women, more than 30 CC should be added because it alone is not going to be helpful. And CC combined with metformin could be an option in those patients who are CC resistant. And according to the guidelines, basically routine use of metformin as adjuvant is not recommended, especially in antagonist protocol. But as I told you, in agonist protocol, it's important because it improves the clinical pregnancy rate as well as reduces the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And we know that laparoscopic ovarian drilling is used as a second-line therapy. And it should not be done just because the patient is CC resistant, because gonadotrophin is a better option, because we know that laparoscopic ovarian drilling has its own complications of decreased ovarian reserve as well as adhesion formation, but could be done when you're doing a laparoscopy for some other reason. So we have to also prevent the follicular phase progesterone elevation, and this can be done by mild stimulation to reduce the number of follicles recruited. We have to individualize the treatment protocols. We have to choose proper, and we have to do a proper and close monitoring of the endocrinological profile during the control ovarian stimulation and trigger at a follicular diameter of less than 18 millimeters. We have to prevent OHSS by identifying the high-risk patients and cycles, use low-risk treatment and specific measures in individual cases. And therefore, before we start, it is important to assess the ovarian reserve and then choose the stimulation protocol, monitor these protocols, and whenever we are using an analog, it's best to use an antagonist. And during stimulation, we have to limit the dose and concentration of HCG what is used. We can use agonist for trigger. In patients who are at a real high risk and we are doing an ART, we can do in vitro maturation of the eggs. We can give prophylactic albumin or starch. We have to transfer single embryos to decrease the multiple pregnancy weight. And after a stimulation segmentation protocol, as I told you, we have to use only progesterone for luteal phase support. Dopamine agonist is used because it decreases the VEGF and therefore decreases the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And there are some papers which talk about using antagonists in the luteal phase to prevent the rise in the E2 levels or to decrease the E2 levels when we're going to freeze all the embryos. But these studies are very small and we cannot really say that there is evidence for that. So in earlier days, apart from cancellation, we didn't have any other option, but today we can give an agonist trigger and freeze all the embryos, and therefore, because we know that HCG is a primary stimulus for the syndrome. We have to avoid multiple pregnancies in an ART cycle by transferring a single embryo. We can select embryos, the best embryo, by doing a blastocyst transfer, and probably people who have these facilities, they could do embryo assessment by using time lapse and aneuploidy assessment by PGS. Luteal phase support, both in IUI and IVF cases, is required when gonadotrophins are used. And you can see that this was a large systemic review which was published, and it can clearly be seen that luteal phase support is beneficial only when gonadotrophins are used either alone or in combination with clomiphene citrate, but not when used just when clomiphene citrate or letrozole is being given. In ART cycles, it is essential, and the luteal phase support is modified when we give an agonist trigger. We have to avoid HCG. We can give GnRH agonist as luteal phase support on day 7 of the oocyte retrieval, and we can add estrogen to progesterone as reported, and you can see that progesterone is effective. We also need to prevent imprinting disorders and epigenetic modifications by mild stimulation protocols, improving the in vitro culture systems, and diet and supplementations of adequate folate. So we know that the endocrine milieu in patients with PCOS can basically result in high LH with normal FSH and therefore high heterogeneous follicles, increase androgens. We can have abnormal granulosa cell function. We have also premature LH surge and peripheral insulin resistance, which is associated with hyperinsulinemia, which results in decreased fertilization rates as well as implantation rates. And as we see, there's increased incidence of OHSS, and it can also affect the oocyte quality. So the recommended approach for gonadotrophin therapy, both in an IUI and in an IVF cycle, is the first is, especially in an IUI cycle, is a dose finding cycle. And we have to begin with a low gonadotrophin dose of 37.5 to 75 IU and increase it either after 7, 10 or 14 days if there's no dominant follicle of more than 10 millimeters, and should be done in small increments and at intervals until evidence of progressive follicular development is observed, and then the same dose should be continued. So when we talk about gonadotrophins in an IUI cycle, basically aromatase inhibitors and anti-estrogen appear to be cost-effective in IUI programs, although less effective compared to gonadotrophins. When gonadotrophins are used, they have to be given on daily basis. Low-dose protocols do not differ significantly in success when compared to high dose, which increases the risk of multiples and OHSS. There is no role of using GnRH agonist or antagonist in an IUI cycle. There is no difference in the probability of conception when one uses either urinary or recombinant preparation. And both CC and letrozole have similar results, and tamoxifen also has shown to give good results. And when we talk about ART cycle, basically we need to take into consideration the age and the ovarian reserve, the duration and cause of infertility, the lab quality, embryo transfer policy, cryo programs, physical and psychological stress, risk of complications, and financial support. And depending on all these factors, we need to choose the gonadotrophin type, dose, the GnRH analog, and trigger for the final oocyte maturation. And this is concluding. So the first line is letrozole, CC, and tamoxifen. And basically this should be done when you have the lifestyle changes have not helped. And then when there is resistant to these drugs, then you can use either gonadotropin or laparoscopic ovarian drilling, which are the second line drugs. And if there's no pregnancy, then IVF is the last option, which is the third line drug. And in an IVF cycle, especially individualized control ovarian stimulation protocols, a freeze-all strategy, and an elective single embryo transfer could help in increasing the success of ART, decreasing the stress and anxiety, and also the complications. And I thank you all for a patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am.
Dr. Shobna, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah, that was an exhaustive coverage, Dr. Madhuri. It left nothing unturned. And the final cartoon was the best. Like, you should have a lot of cash and deaf ear to all the relatives. Otherwise, you can never get pregnant because they get so many advices from so many people. Now we are almost nearing the time that they have given us. So we will quickly go through the chat box and answer the questions, right? So, will you read the questions or should we read the questions, Shield Healthcare?
Ma'am, I mean, yeah, ma'am, we request you to please take up the questions.
Okay, so I will take that first ones first. 1 minute.
I think what is the role of environmental toxins on PCOS?
Okay, yeah. Would you like to take that to anybody or?
No, anyone, otherwise I can answer.
Okay,
so,
you answer.
Environmental toxins are endocrine disruptors. And because they are endocrine disruptors, you have an abnormal hormonal milieu. And as it is in PCOS women, you have an abnormal endocrine milieu. And this is exaggerated by the environmental toxins.
Okay, so Shazia, you're...
Yeah. Then the
normal value, AMH was already...
I've answered for them over there.
Answered. Yes.
Can we give metformin and inositol together? I think we are all, they are even having preparations like that.
I don't think we can give them together. You can use either of them. But we should know, though inositols has resulted in a good outcome, there are certain studies, but still it is considered as experimental drug all over the world because most of the studies which are published have very small number of subjects. So basically it is for us, the Indians, because who have to do, because we have so many patients, basically we need to do a study and publish the data and then only it can come to the world because most of the papers published have about 20, 25, 30 people and that really does not give evidence. And according
Madhuri, I'll tell you.
Guidelines, according to the international guidelines, also according to the ASRM as well as ESHRE, inositols are still experimental drugs. So unless we ourselves study and we come out with a paper, then only we can say, no, it is better and it can be used in all patients. Though most of us are using.
Yeah, the research dose of inositol is 2 grams twice daily, and the research dose of metformin is 500 TDS. And with the companies which are coming out with these combos, they are reducing the dose of both and giving it. I don't know how these companies are coming out with decreasing doses on their own without any research material. That's where we are saying these combos may not work. No. Basically, in my practice, what happens is people cannot tolerate metformin quite often. And the thin PCOD patients where I normally sometimes give even pioglitazone because there are studies on pioglitazone giving pregnancies. And I had many patients who are conceiving on pioglitazone when they are a thin PCOD patient. Pioglitazone makes them put on weight also and you give pregnancies. When these two things, and even pioglitazone, some patients cannot tolerate. So when there is an intolerance to metformin or pioglitazone, it is on, that is when my myoinositol comes in. Or at people who can afford, and they say, suppose you get side effects with metformin, I don't know, you try it out. Madam, you give me any costly preparation, we are ready to take it. And that's where the myoinositol comes in. But this idea of combining both and reducing the dose as per the whims and fancies of medical representatives and choking it down the throat of people, I don't know how far that is good. In the full dose of myoinositol and full dose of metformin, I don't know how many people have really tried it out. It's combo drugs that they're giving is half dose of both together. Anybody else in the audience can unmute themselves and comment on this.
I don't believe in any combination drugs. I've never used in my 40 years of practice.
Yes. Yeah, not at least not in the combination that these drug companies come and give us. And they say X number of doctors are using it, and why you can't use it. How can you be an idiot because so many doctors are using it? This is what they always come and tell. They make you feel bad about it. But you have to use drugs in their research dose because that's the way it has been tried out. Pratibha, what do you want to see? Pratibha, anything more you want to say?
No. What you are saying, that is really correct. We should not combine the drugs. Like I was in Dubai, madam, there no drugs were given in a combination form.
But if they're giving a combination, at least they should have it in the correct dose, no? It's
correct dose.
No, because the absorption and the pharmacokinetics of each drug is different. And therefore, they should not be combined together because their pH and if you see the action is totally different. So no drug should be combined.
Yeah,
but
now there is an
personally, I feel myoinositol is helping. I mean, we don't have the proper data in India, but we are giving to the patients.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your experience, but my experience is very good with myoinositol.
I also get that. I also get
tell you, Pratibha, that you need to record. You need to come out with a paper wherein, unless otherwise, all over the world it is still experimental. All the papers published are very small subjects. So unless all of us gather, we do a multi-centric study and we publish a large number.
That's there. Yeah, we need a study. But I'll tell you this number business, I can never believe all these numbers because when they say they've tried on 100 people, 200 people, 1,000 people, from where do these Goras get this 1,000 people? They have less number of people there than we have here. Imagine getting 100 people for a study. I really don't believe their studies.
I have calculated the number of subjects which is required to prove that myoinositol is better is 2,800. That is the sample size which is required.
You think all India, can you get 2,000 people of PCOD getting myoinositol, even in a crowded country like in India? Can you get that?
All of us can get. It is a multi-centric study and it has to be a randomized control trial. It has to be double-blinded, and it has to be registered with the.
Can you register 2,000 people double-blind like that for myoinositol?
Pardon?
2,000 people double-blinded for myoinositol?
Yes.
You think it's possible?
Yes, of course it is possible.
Why not?
I don't know. I find it's a bit far-fetched to find 2,000 people at the same time going to gynecologist in the same month with the same symptom, and you are double-blinding it.
No study is done over 1 month. The study is done over a period of 1 year.
No, but double-blinding it has to be done at the same time.
Yes, it has to be double-blinded. If it is not double-blinded, it has zero value. That's all.
Anyway, okay. We will leave that. Okay. Now let's go on to the next question. Yeah.
There is one question for you. What food is prescribed in lean PCOS? There is a question for you, Shobna madam.
Lean PCOS, I would say myoinositol is good for lean PCOS. So give them all the foods containing inositol. If they are non-vegetarians, give them meat and eggs also, but without the yellow part of it, of course. And fruit sources of inositol like oranges, peaches, pears, bananas you can give. Grains are good. Legumes and sprouts and all the tomatoes, potatoes, really there is a doubt. And they say milk is not good, but milk products are good. And green leafy vegetables, nuts and seeds, they like all that. So all that is good for lean PCOS. And all those powders I told you, I have got a list of things I've been giving over 20 years now. All that, the things I showed you, licorice root and I tell them don't throw out your pumpkin seeds, your fenugreek and your all those things. cinnamon, all that I'll tell them, you powder them and you take, they are normally staying in the hostels, no? So they powder them, put them in bottles and take them to the hostels, and they just take a little pinch of that thing, whatever it is. Whenever you have time, you just take a pinch of it once in a while. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes they go to somebody like Pratibha in Bhagalpur, I don't know. But as long as they come back to me, sometimes it works. That's all I can say. But yes, sometimes it works.
Environment also affects. Madam, environment also affects. Environment also affects.
And they have to walk. I tell them, you walk when you study, and you know, it's not just it's not only the drugs. It's of course we have to give them drugs, and then you have to tell them to exercise. They sit in front of their computers and their mobile phones, and they don't have walk, and they go on drinking tea. Basically, it's the drinking tea and the juices that makes them gives them a problem, you know. But lean PCOS, that cannot be a problem because they are lean. So there you can make them eat more, because even thinness can give you infertility just as much as obesity can give you infertility, because hypothalamic
No,
and
basically,
all yes, Madhuri.
We are all basically sarcopenic. So our muscle mass is less. So in a thin patient also, they have to exercise to increase their muscle mass. So they should do weights. Then only that's going to be helpful.
Okay, that's a good tip. And high protein diet is necessary, because then if they're not able to take the high protein diet, they're all finicky people, no? All these young girls. There you can give protein supplements. So the mother is at least happy. It's like that advertisement of Vicks, no? When the mother is applying Vicks, and Vicks is not useful for the child, but the mother applying it, mother is feeling happy. So you give them protein supplements, even if the girl is not taking it, at least the mother will be happy, no? That way. But high protein diet is important. But jokes apart, high protein diet is important. For this thing. Somebody is asking whether you should give Evetone 2 milligram BD from 7 to 12 days.
There's one more question. That is, letrozole causes monofollicular development. That is because of its mechanism of action by reducing the estradiol levels, because it increases the aromatase, and therefore the amount of FSH which is secreted from the pituitary is graded, and therefore you have monofollicular development. And then cutoff value for AMH to do ovarian drilling and gonadotrophin first line. There's no cutoff for AMH value to do ovarian drilling. That's what I said, that if you're basically, going to go for any other procedure, but if the patient cannot afford gonadotrophin therapy, laparoscopic ovarian drilling is a one-time treatment, but many a times you require to supplement it with ovarian induction drugs. And probably if the AMH values are more than 8 nanograms per ml, it becomes more helpful, because these are more resistant to the ovulation induction drugs.
Yeah, then the Evetone, I think they are talking of Evetone.
There is no level, then there is no this thing of oocyte donation in any PCOS patient. That's totally wrong. The patient as well as the doctor has to have patience to gradually use a low dose or a chronic low dose protocol. And basically all patients are treatable. Oocyte donation is not a treatment for any patient with high AMH in PCOS.
Yeah.
Best protocol for PCOS again is a low dose chronic low dose protocol in a IUI patient, and a low dose protocol in an ART patient.
Madhuri, but what is your low dose protocol? It seems to be going on for 1 month. Of 7 days, sleep 37.5, then 7 days, 75, then 7 days. Who will wait for 1-2 months and all with their injections coming to you again and again?
I do it. I mean, that is what I said. Both the doctor and the patient has to have patience.
That's highly. When taking injections for 3 weeks, 4 weeks and all, I don't know. You are patients. You are.
And almost 50% of them conceive. So why should a patient be subjected to IVF when the patient can conceive with IUI? And I think it's important to remember that whenever you're stimulating a patient with gonadotropin, it's best to do an IUI. That is because pregnancy rate of gonadotropin with timed intercourse is only 8%, as against gonadotropins with IUI, which is about 16 to 20%. So no cycle of gonadotropin should be, a patient should be told to go for timed intercourse. It's better to go for an IUI. And the other important thing is that you have to give the gonadotrophins daily. There's no use of gonadotrophins being given on alternate days, which many gynecologists give. Because
so many give, they combine it with letrozole or
no, whatever it is, it should not be given, because all the follicles, I'm just showing you, they have a particular threshold whenever you're going.
So you don't believe in combining it with...
rises above the threshold, your follicles are going to start going. If you're going to give alternate days, you're going to high, low, high, low. So all the follicles which are going to grow there, once the dose is it's not given on alternate days, that day it's not given, they're all going to become apoptotic, and therefore you're not going to have good number of follicles and good quality of oocytes.
That we accept.
Therefore, it is very, very important that you give the gonadotropins on daily basis, or you don't give at all.
No, what about combining it with CC or letrozole? Then
no, I just
back
showed
to back.
You combine it with CC, but once the gonadotropins are started, so you give in the earlier 5 days your CC or letrozole, and then from day 6 you start your gonadotropin.
Only thing is, whenever you give it continuous.
You have to give it every day.
Yeah. And you have to tell the patients to have one.
There's no role on alternate days, because you're just wasting the patient's time and money.
Yeah. So tell them 2-3 weeks you have to take injections, and only you'll get pregnant first itself when they come.
No, not like, I mean,
be ready.
Some patient, only the patients, if you see at the ovaries only, you know that this patient is not going to respond early. If you have more than 30-35 follicles on each side, you know that this patient and her AMH values are more than 7. You know that this patient is a poor responder in the PCOS group. And these patients should be counseled that they have to take gonadotropins for a longer time.
Okay, so AMH value is very important. That comes to Pratibha. I told you, be ready with your.
No, but AMH and antral follicular count. It's not only AMH, because if you have a place wherein a smaller place where they are not using the second generation in equipments for AMH evaluation, and as Pratibha very nicely explained, that if you're storing it and if the temperature is not maintained, you're not going to get the correct values, and therefore you have to rely more on your antral follicular count in smaller places than AMH, unless you're very sure that it is a second generation.
So Pratibha, for us, GP infertility specialist, how do you look at the ovarian reserve? The general practitioners.
Yeah, what?
That is why antral follicular count is a good.
Antral follicle count, madam. Antral follicle count you can do, because now most of the gynecologists are having ultrasound. So at least they can do, and they can, they can count the follicles, and with this they can have some. So antral follicle count, AMH you can do, but what I have seen here in my practice only, I have seen so many times there is so much disparity in AMH levels. That patient when comes from outside, the levels are something different. When I get it done, it is something different. So I don't always rely on AMH values, but antral follicle count is in our hands.
The best. The best. Okay.
The
best.
Okay. There's one more question, Dr. Shobna, on using estrogen when the endometrial growth is thin.
Yeah. So but then my objection to that question is, written the drug is Evelon. Evelon is such a weak estrogen. Why use Evelon? There are so many better estrogens. No, you can give ethinyl estradiol or estradiol valeriate.
Basically, this is estradiol valeriate. That is the
drug.
No, this is
not Evelon.
Yeah, they've given the name. So it is estradiol valeriate only. This is the drug which is being used. So basically, there's no indication really to use any estrogen, especially in an oral ovulation cycle. If it is not effective, basically you have to use gonadotropins. But with gonadotropins also, if you find that the inner lining of the uterus has not grown, then you have to do a hysteroscopy to see whether the patient has any chronic endometritis, other tuberculosis or non-tuberculosis. And these patients should be treated with doxycycline 100 milligrams for 14 days before you do a next cycle for her. And if at all you want to add estrogen, it has to be added only once the follicular diameter is more than 16 millimeters, because if you add it before that, the estrogen levels will increase, especially in a non-ART cycle. It will result in an LH surge, and you'll have a premature rupture of follicles, and you'll also have a premature rise in the progesterone level, which is going to affect the endometrial receptivity. And therefore, if at all you're using estrogen, it should not be started before the follicular diameter has reached 16 to 17 millimeters.
In earlier tests, they used to say 8 millimeter. Now we have changed it into 16 millimeter.
16 millimeters, the follicular size, not
I
the...
know that, even
Yes.
that, and when I used to give attend classes,
No,
some
it
20
has to-
years back,
no,
it was
is
8
not
millimeter.
age. It is
8
the
day, it was not 8 millimeter, it was 8 day.
No, it is nothing 8 day. It depends upon the follicular size, because that's
Okay.
the normal physiology of ovulation. Because if you use it before the follicle is 16
The dominance has not occurred, then
no,
oval
it's
will
going
not
to
come
result
back.
in a premature LH surge, which is going to
So
hamper
the-
the oocyte quality, the endometrial receptivity, everything, and therefore it has not to be used.
So give doxycycline, give estrogen if at all after 16 weeks, and if your patient can afford
16
hysteroscopy,
days.
do a hysteroscopy, right?
16 days.
16 days is doxycycline.
Not 16. No.
16 millimeter follicle.
Yeah. And you have
Yeah.
to do doxycycline in a cycle where you're not doing the cycle, because doxycycline is a contraindicated drug for pregnancy.
Yeah.
And therefore, probably you should do so. Whichever cycle you're doing your hysteroscopy, you can anyway give doxycycline, because your patient is not going to try for pregnancy. And the next cycle, today there's a lot of being spoken also on the microbiome and the various
Can
things.
they ask them to take curds every day?
Yeah, curds is
Again.
only for the, it is basically only for the gut microbiome and not for the vaginal or the uterine.
For that, you have to give your microbiome. There are a lot of drugs which can be placed in the vagina to improve the microflora in the vagina. That's what you're telling. And oral drugs are also available to improve the microbiomes, no?
Yeah.
So that's also important in an IVF cycle. So you're given us tips like doxycycline in a non-treatment cycle, estrogen to be held on, and you're saying give gonadotropins before trying estrogen. Give people
because estrogen should not be given, because now there is no evidence of giving estrogen at all, especially in a CC or a letrozole cycle where you have a thin endometrium. So basically, in these cases, you need to give gonadotropins. If with the gonadotropins also, if you have a thin endometrium, you need to do a hysteroscopy to find out the cause for the thin endometrium. And then if you really do not...
But quite often they don't agree to come for the hysteroscopy. They don't have the money for that. That is the main problem.
Then you can... but that's an important thing, because that gives a diagnosis. But if they don't have, you can just give empirical doxycycline then for 14.
It's quite often the scenario, because by the time they come to you, they would have already gone to find 10 people. And then if they land in an IVF center, you can imagine they have to collect a lot of money, sell their house and everything and come to you, no? Otherwise, they can't come. So before they sell their house, when you ask for everything, they don't agree. So that is there.
No, but I mean, it is each doctor.
I'm just joking. I'm just joking.
No. I think all doctors, I mean, I'm also giving all the juniors, whoever are attending, it's very, very important that when any patient comes to you, it is important that you need to evaluate their previous treatment protocols, because you must not waste their money by repeating all the tests and doing the same.
Yeah.
So
you have too important. That's very important.
Whatever you're doing. So there's 2 more questions. Estrogen for how many days? Suppose you have started estrogen, then you need to give till the pregnancy test is positive or the patient gets her periods, or till the day you're going to give your progesterone. And do you suggest to do the LH testing? No, you can just look at the endometrium and make out that there is already the LH surge has started, because the appearance of the endometrium totally changes once the LH surge has started, because with the LH surge, there is increase in the progesterone levels and a triple layer becomes more homogeneous, and you know that the LH surge has occurred.
Okay. Is that all?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I think Vidya Tobi is not here, so I will give a vote of thanks to everybody who has attended and was stuck on. All the 68 people, I thank Prabhati Keshri, I can see her on the screen. Sujata CG is there from Trishur. There's other few people I can recognize. Shazia was there earlier. And many of my familiar people who have attended here. I thank all of them. I thank Shield for giving. Shama is there. Hi, Shama. Yeah. So I thank the Shield people. Even 2 days before they told me you give a talk, and I collected all the talks I had in my computer and I put it up there, and then I had to read a little more also on what nutrition to give PCOS people, and I learned also. And we have eminent infertility specialists from the Far East and from the South Center, whatever you call it, and we have people from everywhere combining this interesting session on infertility. I hope all of you benefited from it. Thank you so much. Attendance.
Thank you. Thank you, madam.
Thank you, Dr. Madhuri ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Pratibha ma'am, and Dr. Shabna ma'am,
Yeah.
for that exhaustive preparation and presentation both. Thank you so much for this opportunity to us also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
all
Thank you.
who attended.
So shall we leave now?
Yes. Yes. please.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye, madam.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.